God our Father and our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. The scripture portion for today's daily Byte meditation is taken from the book of Job, chapter 2. The book of Job, chapter 2. If you haven't read chapter 2 before, I request you all to kindly pause this video and read Job chapter 2 first. Before I start my daily Byte sermon, let me read few of verses that I want to highlight today. Job chapter 2, verses 7 onwards. So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and afflicted Job with painful sores from the soles of his feet to the top of his head. Then Job took a piece of broken pottery and scraped himself with it as he sat among the ashes. His wife said to him, "Are you still holding on to your integrity? Curse God and die." He replied, "You are talking like a foolish woman. Shall we accept good from God and not trouble?" In all this, Job did not sin in what he said. This is the word of the Lord. If I ask you all a question, who is God for you? If I ask you a question, who is God for you? What are the kind of characteristics of God? Most of you will say that God is a healer. Most of you will say God is a father, healer, protector, deliverer, conqueror, Messiah, King, Creator, and so on. We have so many characteristics of God that in our day-to-day experience. In today's passage, we see that though Job had lost everything in his life, though he was afflicted with physical illness, though he was afflicted physically, we see that Job maintains his innocence. And Job is so confident that one day he will be vindicated by God, that one day all these things will solve. Though he was going through so much of pain and suffering in his life, we see that Job stood firm. If you see the book of Job, if all those who have read this book, Job, right from the first chapter till the last, one of the most main thing that comes to our mind is why I am suffering. One of the most key theme of the book of Job is why does the righteous suffer? Why does the righteous suffer is one of the main theme of the book of Job. If you ask me why does humankind suffer? Why does humans suffer? Why does Christians suffer? Well, I would like to highlight two reasons for it. Two reasons for suffering is sometimes we suffer because of these two reasons. One is sometimes it's because of our own sins, it's because of our own fault, we suffer. Because of our own mistakes, because of our own failures, because of the wrong decisions that we have taken in our lives, we suffer. But if you see in a secondary way, that sometimes suffering can be the consequences of our own sin. Because we have free will and we can do whatever we want. And sometimes because of our own sin and because of our own mistakes and shortcomings, humans suffer, Christians suffer. And the second reason why Christians suffer is because suffering is due to sin, yes, but sometimes suffering is because of the sin of others. Sometimes because of some other people's fault, we suffer. Because of some other people's sin, we suffer. Sometimes, for example, children suffer from irresponsible parents. It's because of the parents' sin, children suffer. The poor and the hungry in our country and various other countries, they suffer because of the economical sin, because of the economical injustice that they are facing. It's also a sin. Sometimes people suffer because of injustice. Sometimes the refugees from the cruelties of war. And we see there are so many of road accidents in day-to-day lives because of some other's fault. Somebody else who is innocent suffers. So there are two kinds of suffering. There are two reasons we Christians generally in human beings suffer. One reason is because we are sinful. The second reason is because of some other sin, we get affected, we suffer. Many of our times in our Christian life, many of us have faced suffering. It might be because of our own childhood trauma that we have faced when our young age, and that would have resulted in a lifelong emotional damage. Or suddenly, without warning, a painful illness would have taken over us. Some of us are going through a very, very bad health problems. You might be facing a lot of problems at work. You might be facing a lot of problems financially, but you might be facing through poverty. You might be facing through bereavement. Or sometimes you might be suffering because you are still single, you are not able to find a life partner. Sometimes you are suffering because of a broken love affair. Sometimes you are suffering because of an unhappy marriage. Sometimes you are suffering because of divorce, depression, loneliness, and so on. Suffering comes in many ways throughout our lives, in various forms, in various types, to various people. And sometimes the first question when people suffer, the first question that generally comes to our mind is, why God? Why me? Why God and why me? And sometimes when our physical health goes down, our spiritual lives also gets affected. Sometimes when we are physically weak, when we suffer, when we are going through a lot of diseases, when we are going through a lot of medication, it automatically it affects our spiritual lives as well. Like as I first asked when I started my short speech, I asked, what are the characteristics of God? Like most of us would have answered, Messiah, Creator, Healer, Provider, Father. But when suffering comes, when there is stillness, when our physical health goes down, our spiritual lives also gets affected. And when our spiritual life gets affected, all those things that we think about God gets shattered sometimes. Sometimes we think that when we suffer, we think that God is not a prayer answering God. Sometimes when we suffer, we think that God doesn't love us. God is not listening to our prayers. God is not really taking care of us. Sometimes we think that while we are suffering, God is not love, God is not a healer, God is not a provider. All these doubts comes to our minds. But in chapter 2 of the book of Job, we see that Job just endured his suffering patiently and never cursed God. Biblical teaching and personal experiences thus combines to teach us that, that suffering is a path to holiness and maturity. When we meet people and when we listen to testimonies of people of how they suffered, we always get that there's always something special about those people who have suffered really badly. There is always something special about people who have suffered. They have a fragrance that lacks in others. They exhibit the meekness and humility in their life. And those who suffer, they try to endure patiently. They have a lot of endurance too, to endure their sufferings very patiently. And they look at the world and God in a very positive light. And that's the small thing that we could learn from Job today. Whatever our problems is, whatever health problems that we are facing, whatever problems that you and I that we are going through, Job is teaching us that to endure it patiently and never curse God and never doubt on His love and His promises. This is the word of the Lord.